Good morning. There's all different kinds and different levels of empty. For example, there's the emptiness of outer space. It's not really empty because there's planets and there's asteroids and there's lots of Elon Musk's new satellites. But because the space of space is so vast, we think of it as empty. Then there's the empty of an empty refrigerator. Now, this refrigerator that I'm in right now is technically not empty, but if somebody said you could go and get something to eat from this refrigerator, you wouldn't be wrong if you said, but that refrigerator is empty. Now, it's not really empty because obviously there's a banana in the refrigerator, and there's also shelves and lights. So the refrigerator is not technically empty, but for all practical purposes, it's empty. And then there's the emptiness of emptiness, when really there's nothing to see. And this is virtually empty. So there's different ways that we talk about things being empty. And it's the same way in our lives too. For example, if you're a basketball player, if you lose the game, you could feel like you have a sense of emptiness inside. If you graduate from school, you could feel like you should be at a graduation. But this year, you get a sign in your yard that says you're a graduate, but you don't really get a graduation. If there was an event planned for this month, you could feel really bad that the event didn't happen. For example, you might have had a wedding scheduled, and now, for different reasons, the wedding has been postponed, or you don't get to go to the wedding. So you're left with a sense of emptiness because there's no wedding for you, and you don't get to go to the event that you wanted to go to. So I don't mean to make light of these things, but we all experience emptiness in different ways. Of course, there's a much more profound sense of emptiness, which is when we lose somebody close to us, either a family member or somebody that we love very much. And at times like that, we all experience a deep sense of emptiness. This month, we've had statistics every day if you follow the news or read news reports. And we see statistics of people who are dying every day from the coronavirus. And one of the things that can happen is that these statistics are just that, statistics. And we don't really think about this as reflecting actual people who have passed away. But for the people who know someone who has passed away during this last month, we know there's no such thing as a person being a statistic. People are not statistics to us, and they are not statistics to God. We've had some very sad losses as a congregation over the last month, and the emptiness that we feel in saying goodbye to somebody like Tom Nelson as a church, it's a profound sense of emptiness. I got a note from a friend of mine in England who was writing to console and encourage me and Lisa in terms of going through things that we've been through in the last month. And he was going back to talking about how upset he was and how he yelled at God as he was going for a walk one time when he was in England because he had lost a very close friend. And what struck me about his story is that he's going back 60 years ago And he's talking about the loss that he felt when he was a 15-year-old. And the fact that the freshness of that loss 60 years later struck me. Now, it shouldn't surprise me because I know intellectually that those things don't get old. Sometimes it's the actual loss that makes us feel empty, and sometimes it's the fear or the anticipation of a loss. Either way, it's a significant experience in our lives. The reason that I mention all this is because the story of Ruth that we're studying, at the beginning of it, is really a profound, important statement for us about what it feels like to face and experience seasons or times of emptiness. The reason I say this is that if you look at this important summary verse in chapter 1, Naomi says, as a summary of her experience, she says, I went out full, but I came back empty. Now, one of the things that I loved and how the story of Ruth helped me a few weeks ago when I was reading this is when I realized that Naomi had gone out full and come back empty, and she felt completely emptied of everything that mattered to her. It really gave me this overwhelming sense that God has a place for empty. And then when we face emptiness, we don't need to be afraid that we have also lost God. God has a place for empty. So let's read the first part of Ruth. Let's read chapter 1, verse 5 to 13.
Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you've dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, but we will surely return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Return, my daughters. Why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Return, my daughters. Go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, if I should even have a husband tonight and also bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me.
As I was reading through this story a few weeks ago, I wrote down in my journal, don't minimize this, because it takes us to a place in a woman's journey where she feels the loss of everything that mattered to her. The loss of her husband and her 2 sons in a foreign place is not a minimal story of loss. It's a story of significant loss. When she says, I went out full, but I came back empty, God is putting that there to put a template in front of us so that whatever loss we feel, we can and should read ourselves into this story of Naomi's loss. So when I wrote in my journal, don't minimize this, I was trying to speak to myself a little bit and also now to you to say, if you feel emptiness, don't minimize the story of Naomi and don't minimize your own story, but let those 2 merge together as God puts them together, as he intends it to be, so that we see that we're at the center of God's story And we're also in the same story with Naomi. God has a place for emptiness. But it's also more than just the loss of life. And I'm not trying to minimize the loss of life at all. But sometimes there's added dimensions to things that make it even more challenging for us. For example, think about, for now, people who go through the loss of a family member now, the funerals are more complicated, and the ways to celebrate those people's lives are complicated by the presence of the coronavirus. So there sometimes can be added dimensions to the loss that we feel. And in Naomi's case, what she had left after the loss of her husband and her 2 sons were 2 daughter-in-laws, and she may have loved them very much, but in a sense they were a reminder to her of a sense of failure because they were foreign daughter-in-laws. She had started her life full in her home country and went out feeling probably great about her family, having a husband and 2 young sons. In the course of moving out of Israel, she lost her husband and her sons. And when she was going to return back to Israel, she had with her no one from her original family, but now 2 foreign daughter-in-laws. And I had also noted in my journal, what she had left was foreign and possibly stigmatizing. What she had left was foreign and possibly stigmatizing. What struck me about that is she was maybe calculating that going back to her home country and coming back with foreign daughter-in-laws would provide an extra sense of stigma and failure and loss that would be evident to everybody that she met with when she came back. That's why I say don't minimize her loss. She had lost her family, but she was also coming back feeling like she was going to have to carry a stigma for the rest of her life. This is an intense burden for this woman to carry. A few weeks ago, we talked about how we should read the Old Testament, how we should think about the Old Testament. And what we said, we took a verse from the Apostle Paul where he says, everything that was written in the past was written for us so that we might have hope and encouragement from the Scriptures. So let's interpret this story from the Old Testament in that way. We're looking at a story here of Naomi's loss. And let's put that in the context of the whole story of the Bible and the central message of the Bible and the central event of the Bible, which is Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. And we can see a deep similarity between Naomi's story and the story of the experience of Jesus himself. Naomi, in her loss, is resonating with the loss of Jesus on the cross. Jesus, when he came to the end of his life on the cross, the words that Naomi said, I went out full, but I came back empty, can be applied to Jesus' situation as well. When we read in John 1 that he came to give life and light to the world, but at the end we see that Jesus' life and his light are being completely extinguished by his death on the cross. He has nothing at the end of his life. He started full, and Jesus himself is ending his life in emptiness. So it's an important parallel to make between Naomi's emptiness and the emptiness of Jesus on the cross. If you even think about some of the details that they captured for us in the New Testament, when Jesus was on the cross, it says that the people around the foot of his cross, the soldiers, they bargained for the last thing that he had, which is the clothes that he was wearing. So even Jesus' last garment was taken from him and sold and purchased on the cross. So when we think of that, we can put it in the context of a tremendous emptying that Jesus is experiencing at the end of his life. Now, I don't want anybody, including myself, to experience emptiness like this and to go through the pain of losing family members. And yet, the story of the Book of Ruth, it begins at this place of emptiness. And if we carry that over to the crucifixion of Jesus, we also see that the crucifixion of Jesus, although it's the end of Jesus' earthly life, there's almost no way that you can see that as the end of Jesus' work or Jesus' story. And there's no way you can see that as the end of God's creativity in the world through Jesus Christ. In fact, the story of Ruth, beginning with the emptiness of Naomi, saying, I went out full, but I came back empty. She's describing the end, what she thinks is the end of her story. We learn this in chapter 1 because there's the rest of the story, the real creative part of the story is coming next. And this is an exact parallel of the message of the cross. We read of the crucifixion of Jesus, but then we see the great opening of the work of God through the crucifixion and through primarily the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. So, the emptiness, when we say that God has a place for emptiness, as painful as it is to be empty, the message of the Bible and the hope that we take from it is that that emptiness is the beginning of God's creative work. The emptiness is God's canvas for creating something tremendous and beautiful. I'm not a painter. I can't paint. I can paint cabinets. I can paint houses. But I really can't paint paintings at all. But it's a great illustration because when we reach a point of emptiness, God begins his creative work. We see emptiness and we feel pain. God sees the emptiness and he feels the pain that we feel, but he also sees a blank canvas where he can begin to paint a new experience of his love and his grace in our lives. I mentioned the story earlier of my friend in England who, as a young man, lost a close friend. And he walked down the empty streets of England yelling and screaming out loud at God, wondering why God had to take away his friend. But he wrote in his note to me that at the same time that he was shouting out loud to God about his distress about losing his friend, while he was talking about the pain, he also wrote this. He, meaning God, he knew of my anguish and sent someone to hold my hand just as a father holds the hand of a child. I know someone held my left hand for me on the road. Him, God, whoever. I still don't know why we had to lose John, but I do know that someone held my hand and listened to my anger. It did not bring John back, but it calmed me down, leaving me with a feeling that has been really useful. And again, he's thinking back 60 years. In the middle of his emptiness and in the middle of his crying out to God, he felt an unforgettable presence of God that has carried him and changed his life and stayed with him all these years. It's a good example of God's ability to begin creating in the emptiness. To conclude, I'd like to read a poem that I lifted from Facebook that was posted by a friend of mine named Gerard Kelly. The poem is called A Lonely Time to Die. This is a lonely time to die. The family elsewhere, playing board games, sweating, swearing through living room aerobics, breaking the PlayStation. Here there is silence but for the coughing. Streets empty, windows locked, food on the doorstep. Unclean, unclean, uniformed strangers on bedside patrol hold hands to console, breathless. A FaceTime goodbye, weakening. A prayer to the ceiling. You slip away, cruelly unaccompanied, brutally alone. Yet not so on the receiving end. A heaven-wide holiday in your honor. A sky-wide announcement of your worth. Masked choirs dancing, angel bands, jazz hands, a confetti of petals and gold dust, your fame written on clouds, your name whispered by crowds, your significance spotlighted, your soul saluted, your seasons celebrated. No silence here, but a strong voice, stately, sweet-toned, saying, welcome, child, welcome. I think what Gerard captures in that poem is the contrast of the stark emptiness that can be ours here, but the creativity and the color and the meaning and the significance that floods into our world when we look at it from God's perspective. So when I was reading through Ruth, it gave me great comfort to realize that emptiness is not empty to God. And I hope that as you hear this message, to the extent that you're experiencing emptiness and feel like there's too much space, that you remember that God has a space for empty, and God definitely has a space for you and for your significance.